So, how do you deal with arguments, disagreements, situations where you have a conflict? Now, obviously, anybody who gets emotional, raises their voice, starts going into their feelings, they've just lost the argument. Now, on a balance of probabilities, women are more likely to get into their feelings and become emotional in an argument. And that's why the only way, and this is particularly when it comes to intergender relations, a man should never, ever argue with a woman if she gets emotional and gets into her feelings. Now, why is that? You can't win. The only way to win is just completely stop the argument, walk away, but don't engage. It's a very similar situation. Like, imagine you're in a nightclub and somebody walks past and they bump into you. Now, there's a potential for conflict right there. And if it's a guy that might be a little intoxicated, they might be like, what the fuck? There's a certain level of confrontation potential in that situation. And there's a level of combative energy. Um, so it's the same thing, but if you're dealing with an emotional woman, she's probably gonna do this. Even if you have the best rational, logical, coherent arguments in the world, when she's in her feelings, more often than not, of course there's exceptions, but more often than not, she's not gonna listen, she's not gonna back down, and you're just like talking to a wall in a sense. And the argument is never gonna end. It's just gonna be a kind of a back and forth, talking past each other, screaming contest. So it just absolutely makes no sense. Now, if you're in a nightclub or whatever setting, that there's a guy that you bump into and there's somewhat of a combative energy, you're essentially dealing with an emotional, somewhat erratic, and let's say a short fuse situation. Now, then the guy looks at you, he's like, what the fuck? What's your problem? Now, you already know that there's a combative energy right there. So you know exactly that if you let that combative energy escalate, you become emotional, you invest your ego into it, you're like, yeah, what the fuck is your problem? And then you increase that combative energy until the point where you start pushing, and then you take a stand and you're like, okay, let's start throwing. And at that point, I mean, there's no winner. If you're trying to defend your ego by saying, oh, I'm not a softie, I'm not going to back down, all right? Let's say you win that fight. You punch him in the face, he drops. Okay, so you won the fight. What if he falls on his head? He falls back, hits his head, gets a brain injury, dies, gets paralyzed. Even if he falls on his face or whatever, you punch him in the face, he breaks his teeth, or he breaks his nose, or he hurts his eye and he's got an eye issue afterwards. Then somebody in security comes in, they call the police. They're going to arrest somebody, they're going to press charges. Yeah, you might end up doing jail time. You might be on probation. Um, and you might have to pay thousands in damages. Just for what? To preserve, defend your ego? Is that worth it? Instead of, let's say you have somebody who's either drunk, they have a bad attitude, or they're just looking for a fight. They start, doing this. You sense the combative energy. Just be like, all right, no worries, mate. Walk away. Then you swallow your pride, but nobody's going to jail. Nobody's getting hurt. And there's no collateral damage because you're not invested with your ego, right? It's the same thing if you have an argument with, say, a colleague or a friend, family member, whatever. If you invest your ego into it, or you're frustrated and you're trying to vent out, you're never going to win. So it's kind of like, imagine a child wants something, they want candy. You're at a store and the kid wants candy. And you're like, no, you can't have candy. I'm not gonna let you buy it. So the kid essentially realizes like they don't really have any strong arguments. to justify them getting that candy. So what do? They might start screaming, crying, demanding, trying to use whatever means they possess in order to try to convince you in order to let them buy the candy. So people who get emotional in arguments or disagreements, basically they're running out of rational and logical arguments, and they try to override the lack of arguments through emotion, threats, ultimatums, or just getting upset. So if they're wrong, they can't back their claims up. They get emotional to win the argument. And this is a very typical female tactic. Um, and for men, if it's two guys having a disagreement argument, gets emotional, then they might fight. Both cases are completely stupid. I mean, this leads to the next part of it. Like, after you realize somebody gets emotional, they're running out of rational, logical arguments, just walk away. No point in raising your voice. No point in trying to grind your point through if they're just not listening. It's like water under the bridge, and they refuse to acknowledge your points, and they refuse to have a normal conversation like adults. Just walk away and be like, all right, when you cool down a bit, then let's talk. That leads to ultimatums. People who give you ultimatums, they do that out of a position of weakness. If you have a strong bargaining position, you don't have to do ultimatums. You can always say, okay, there's two options of what we're going to do here. But it's not an ultimatum like, oh, we've been together for 3 years. Either you propose to me or we're done. That's an ultimatum. If anybody ever did that to me, I'd be like, all right, hit the road. Like, no. I'm not going to be pressured into that. Whenever you have an option, we always do have a choice. You're never going to give in to an ultimatum because that person is doing that out of a position of weakness. It's like, oh, it's my way or the highway. You can always say, for example, these are my boundaries. Either you choose to respect them and we're good, or I define my boundaries and you choose not to respect them. You have the freedom of walking away. It's that simple. Arguing whether that boundary is right in the eyes of my colleague, family member, girlfriend, that's pointless. If you know what your boundaries are, you state them in a coherent manner. And once you've stated that, you say, well, this is my boundary. You have a choice now to accept it or reject it. Now, when it comes to dealing with arguments, if it's something that has to be dealt with right now, and it's something that cannot be postponed, and let's say you're in a negotiation and you have to figure it out, and only then you'll walk away out of that room, right? So how do you deal with that if you're dealing with somebody who's very difficult to talk to and get your point across? It is this very old tactic that you use, which is you let the person on the other side of the table, so to speak, you let them present their argument to you. Thereafter, you will voice their point to them in a manner that they will deem acceptable. So essentially, whatever comes out of my mouth in terms of what their point should be, if they're happy with the formulation I give to their argument, then they've got their point across. And then we do vice versa. I have an argument, I have a point, and I will have them repeat my point in a manner that is satisfactory to me, so that whatever they say, I perceive that to be my argument in essence. Once you do that exercise, number one, it's very difficult to be emotional when you try to kind of understand somebody. Because the other problem when it comes to arguments, a lot of people don't listen. They hear you, but they only hear you in order to come up with a counter argument. So that means when you're talking past each other. So essentially, when you have your so-called partner, opponent, whatever that might be, repeat your point, they have to calm down, they have to listen. And when you do that once or twice or three times with a given individual, they already kind of know that now it serves no point to become emotional or start to increase a combative energy or whatnot. So in terms of arguments, yeah, somebody gets emotional, you have to treat them like a child, because an adult doesn't necessarily, they don't need to get emotional because they have a point, they can articulate it properly. Um, but yeah, there's my 2 cents on the how to argue issue. So um, I do admit that there's a caveat in terms of what is a heated discussion, but there's a difference in tone when it's an argument, when it's like this. And a heated discussion is just something that you're passionately discussing. But if you're just like yes, no, nah, forget it, man. So if you don't think that I'm for real on this one, come and challenge me to an argument one time and see if I get heated or I follow the principle I just told you. Anyways, have a good one, guys.